Hello, my name is Carl Irwin, and this is a short tutorial on a recent uh, video shot composite that I put up on my YouTube site and YouTube channel, and a number of people have asked for a tutorial on this, so I'm going to give you a short look into this project file, and you can take a look at it and see if there's any way you could apply some of these ideas or concepts to your own projects. This is the video right here. It's a submarine underwater moving through what looks like very murky kind of water conditions, and you can see that there's these light rays shining down. You can see that there are these particles, these bubbles in the water, and they are kind of illuminated by the light rays. You can see the sub has a caustic kind of sunlight reflection on it, and you can see that there is depth to this water, that it appears that the sub is coming out of some kind of a volumetric space. Now what this is this is really just a composited shot. It's not really, there's really no, with the exception of the particle system that's used in here and this caustic reflection element that's on the submarine, there are no 3D modeled objects in this shot at all. Everything in here is a two-dimensional asset and is used in the 3D scene of Blender in the 3D viewport as a 3D composite. Let me show you very quickly what the parts of this project are. We start with this picture right here. This is just a photograph of a model sub. So this is not even a photograph of a real sub, it's just a little scale model of a submarine. And what I did was I created a mask. So using the contrast tools in GIMP, I was able to create a mask that I was able to apply. Here's the mask. I was able to apply it to the sub, and then I could key out the color and get a clean image of the sub with transparency. So this is just a PNG image of the submarine. You can see I even removed some of the elements that are in there that were unnecessary. There's a little flag on top. Some of the parts of the masts here, the radio mast, came off. There's also, I removed the little turbine back here, the propeller, thinking that I might actually add a movable propeller, but if you look in the shot you really can't see that the very end of the boat, so it really didn't matter. But I did remove those things, and this is the two-dimensional asset that we end up with. So that's the first piece that we're going to use. I also created a gradient. This I just did in GIMP. You could do this in Blender. That's not a problem. You can use gradients in Blender and create them on separate layers. But I found that using Blender, and especially rendering in Blender, moves along a lot faster if you don't have Blender achieving too many tasks at one time. So whenever I can make something in GIMP as just a PNG image or just a texture, I rather make it there rather than do it in GIMP, or rather than do it in Blender. Here is this is a vignette. So this is alpha transparent in the center, and just a black outline here, an oval shape, and I made this in GIMP as well. Again, you can do this in Blender, but it requires that you in the compositing node that you do a number of things and add a few steps to the compositing that inevitably will slow down your render time a little bit. And then one last PNG overlay here is just the black bars to get the anamorphic widescreen. Now you don't have to do this at all. You can use just the camera and make your camera dimensions fit your project, output video size that you want, the aspect ratio. But there's some things that doing that, some things that are limited in the compositor by doing that. If you do that, there are certain functions within the compositor that fit in terms of the changeable elements of the nodes can only fit within your picture size. So by doing this and adding an overlay, we gain a little bit of extra space margin on the top and bottom, In fact, one trick that I've done before is that in order to use the full potential of some of the nodes, I would render something out in a very strange aspect ratio that might actually be taller than it is wide, and then bring that in as an image sequence in the 3D view and put a new camera on that final image sequence and then recomposite it out, just so I can use the full capacity of the nodes, particularly the directional blur. We do use the directional blur node in this shot, and one of the movable elements of the directional blur is you set the point from which the directional blur is originating, and it only allows you to go to the top edge of the frame. So it doesn't allow you to go beyond that, which is unfortunate. It's an unfortunate limitation in Blender. But anyway, long story short, sometimes it's just better to make these overlays in GIMP and then use them on your project than it is to do it inside of Blender. It cuts down on render time, and it also allows you to use some of the compositing features to the maximum potential. So let's take a look at the Blender project. We go to the 3D view, and you can see here this is the image plane, and if we kind of rotate around, this is imported as a plane. If you go to the user preferences and you enable in the add-ons, we'll type in plane, you can enable import export image, import images as planes, and inside of the Blender render, this is the internal render engine, you can import these images just as planes. You go to the import menu and select images as planes, and then you can select an image from there. You make it shadeless and enable alpha transparency. You get something like this. So if we go back to the camera view and we hit play, if we select play on this and we let this animate, you can see animation's a little choppy here because we're recording, but you can see that what's happening is this image is just moving on the X and Y axis and scaling. It's getting slightly larger. It's actually not moving forward in space. Here, if we come out of the camera view, you can see it's just scaling as it moves on the X and Y value. And what I did is I set this to appear as though it's traveling in the direction that it's pointing, and as it would be doing that, it should be coming closer to the camera and ever so slightly would increase in size. So here's the end point of the traveling, here's the beginning point. You can see that the scale changes. So we set some keyframes for that. If you look also at the graph editor, it's very important that you set this movement to linear rather than as a Bezier curve, because the linear curve is direct point to point. It doesn't have a gradual slow to fast to slow motion. You can also just select these points. If you hit V on your keyboard and select vector, it will do a very similar kind of thing on these points here. It will make them linear rather than F-curve type shapes. So that is that's the submarine. If we look here at some of the other elements that are in this project and enable some of them so we can see, I also placed in this scene some light rays, and these light rays are just planes, two of them, one here, one right behind it, and actually if we select both of them, we can see through them. For some reason in the texture mode, they both have to, you have several objects that have transparency. They all need to be selected in order for you to see through them from front to back. Now this was created in another Blender project in which, in fact, let me see if I can open that up. I don't know, I'm kind of running slow right now as it is because we're recording. But this is a project, another Blender project, Light Rays. Pop this open, see if it'll open for us. And this project, if it opens, will probably crash the system trying to do this. Here we go. This project is very simply a just one single plane as the 3D view opens here. Apologize for the slowness. Just one single plane with a cloud texture on it, and the cloud texture is mapped. If we select the plane here and waiting for it to enable. Try that again. There we go. The cloud texture is mapped so that the y-axis is very, very stretched out. And if I can get this to scroll down, maybe this was a bad idea here. Here's the mapping. You can see that the x is 1, z doesn't matter, and y is 0.005. And what that does, if I render one frame of this, you'll see that what we get are these long lines. So let me hit render very quickly and see if this will render fast enough for us to check it out. What you get are these very elongated lines of light and dark. So there's transparency and then this light white color. And what I did is I also mapped the cloud texture to an empty, and as the empty moves through the scene, these will animate, and it will create kind of this sporadic movement of these lines. And what I did is I then export that, render that out as an image sequence, again with transparency enabled, and we end up with this kind of an image sequence here of moving rays, and hopefully you can see that on your monitor, that these rays are moving kind of to the right, and they're also morphing and changing. So I can import as planes, image planes, the sequence in two different versions. One's kind of in the foreground, flipped on the y-axis, and the other one is a little bit further back. And I set the transparency to low so we can kind of see through that, and set them on a separate layer. I can render out a pass in my composite of these light rays that are moving. If we look from the camera view, you can see that because they're tilted on the x-axis, they kind of spread out away from the upper edge. Okay, so let me disable these right now so we can see through. The next thing that I placed in here is a sphere on the very top. This is just a big white sphere that's elongated, and it's shadeless. Everything in the scene is shadeless. And I'm going to use this in the compositor to create just kind of an aura of light up here on the top edge of the screen. And also by fading this in the compositor, I can use this as a mask for the light rays, so that the light rays will show up only in the area that has this white color on it. And we'll take a look at that in a minute in the compositor. The next thing that we have in here is a cylinder. I'll enable that, and another cylinder inside of it. And these two cylinders, the outer cylinder has a texture on it that is a, let me select the cylinder. Wrong one. It is, I'm not sure how you say this, Voronoi, I think is how you say it, or Voronoi, I'm not really sure. But it's a texture that looks kind of like water, or cellular kind of water light reflections, or cellular kind of structures. And this is the texture that is around the cylinder, and the texture is applied as a cylinder. And then inside of that cylinder is another one, which is just a flat black shadeless texture. So when we render this layer, the layer that these cylinders are in, we end up with a cylinder that has this refracting kind of light, and that texture, the Voronoi texture, is attached to an empty that moves through the scene and allows this texture to kind of move and morph over top of this cylinder, and we're going to use that as the caustic reflections. You can see that it's kind of lined up so that it would sort of match the motion path of our submarine here. And as the submarine moves through this, it would kind of line up with this cylinder, and we get a kind of depth perspective on this reflection, this reflective pattern. It's not perfect, but the illusion will be good enough for what we're going to use it for in the compositor. Now, this is a really good, important point here in terms of compositing. You can see that the cylinder does not in any way, shape, or form actually line up with the flat submarine image. And it doesn't really have to, because our camera is locked down. As long as the camera is not moving, all we need to do is have these assets kind of lined up so that they would look like they line up in the shot, in the final shot. Okay, so that is the reflection pass that we're going to use. Also, as part of that, there is another plane. That's not that one. Let me see if we have it. No, not that one. These are the particles. There it is. Okay, there's a big black plane. This is a shadeless black, and it sort of divides the motion path of the submarine and the caustic reflection texture on the cylinders in half. And we're going to use this as a mask as well by blurring it in the compositor node to allow the caustic reflection texture to match only the top side of the submarine. And we'll look at that in a minute. The last thing that's in here is these two planes that have particle systems on them. These are just halo particle systems that are set to 0 gravity and high. They have some movement on them. If we take a quick look at the particle settings here, the Brownian force is set to 0.3. So these particles, once they're emitted, they will kind of wander around very slowly, and they'll move kind of against each other, not necessarily on the same direction, and that just creates the illusion of bubbles or debris kind of moving around inside of a fluid. And I have 2 of these image planes in there so that it just gives us a little bit of depth. And the size of these particles are very, very small. They're just, again, just white halos, hardness set to the default 50, and the size is only 0.025. So this is these are on another layer yet separate from everything else. In fact, I've got 6 layers going here. Everything is kind of set on its own layer for compositing. So let's take a quick look at the compositor, and we can see how this fits together. If we hit Control left arrow, we can see the compositor. You'll notice that my image, or my final image output, is reversed from the setup inside of the 3D scene. That's just something I decided to do to make it look a little bit differently and remove it from the context of the original photograph that we used. Anyway, take a look here. We can see what we have. First, I brought in the gradient picture that we made in GIMP, and I applied that to an RGB color, background color. I assume that you know something about compositing. If you don't know anything about using the compositing nodes, you should definitely learn. Check out sorry, not Andrew Kramer. He's a Video Copilot. Andrew Price's ebook, The Wow Factor. Very, very good source for understanding how the compositing nodes work in the original Blender render setup. Anyway, I have an RGB color, and this is just a dark blue color, and then on top of that I have a multiply node, a mix node set to multiply, and with this gradient so that it adds the light color, this white, on there. And then I also use the gradient later on whenever I mix in the final sub composite, and the gradient is set to the factor on an alpha over node so that the light part, the white part of the gradient, is where the submarine shows up clearly, and the dark part is where the submarine will show up somewhat transparent, and we can see through it to the color behind it, this blue background. Now, what that creates is the illusion that there's actually material in front. There's actually depth to this murky water. But really what's happening is we're looking through the submarine to the background. Now, this trick only works when you have a solid color in the background, or a solid kind of gradient transition here. If I had any objects in the background behind the sub, this would not work because we would see that the sub is actually transparent. We would be looking through it. So that's how we accomplish that depth inside of the scene. Now, if we look at the sub, the composition of the sub, there are a lot of things going on here. We have the input layer for the submarine itself. I added an RGB curve and I set it so that it would turn the sub completely white, and we're going to use this as a mask to add on our caustic reflection. So on the caustic reflection input render layer, we have that. If we zoom in here really close, you can see it. Here's our cylinder with a caustic reflection. This is coming through and into the bottom slot of an add node, and we're going to add that to our submarine image by using the white mask that we created and applying that to the factor on top of a black background. So what it does is it creates this outline of this caustic reflection, but in the outline of the submarine. Also, as part of that mask, we blur this black line, this black plane mask, so that we can cut off half of this cylinder. That's applied into this alpha over, and it is applied on top of the caustic image to cut out the bottom half of it. So we end up with this half sub caustic reflection, and then that is then applied via an add node set very low, 0.05, and added to our final submarine image. And we end up with this image that you see in the final shot, with the submarine and very, very faint caustic reflection on top of it. So kind of a cheap trick there. We didn't really reflect anything, any lights on anything. We're just using a texture, an animated texture that kind of has the same geometry in space, and then applying it to the submarine to further sell the illusion. This final submarine is then what is input on top of our background gradient, and again with the white and black gradient set as the factor to create the depth. That image then passes into our light rays, and our light rays are on a separate render layer. And what I did is I took the light ray composite and I then made another output of that. I flipped it, used the flip node from the transform node menu, and I scaled it up 3 times as big, and I added that again on top of the original, and that just added a lot more light rays and a lot more sporadic movement. So it looks like there's really no logic to the light rays moving around, and it also added a little bit more depth because again our camera is locked down, so as long as the camera is not moving, this does look like it adds depth. If our camera was moving, none of this would work. We then apply the light rays using another mask, and that mask is generated from this big sphere that's elongated on the top of the scene. And this sphere has a couple of blur nodes applied to it, fast Gaussian blur, with 400 units on the y-axis on this one, 500 units on this one. They are added together. Actually, I'm sorry. The one with 500 is used as the mask, and it is applied to the factor of the overlay of the light rays. And what that does is it makes the light rays strong on the top, and as that light gradient that we created with the blur on the sphere dissipates, the light rays also dissipate down near the bottom of the screen. So it makes it look a little bit more organic and realistic and not quite so solid. This is added using an add node to our scene over top of the submarine, and then I also applied another blurred version of this sphere on top of that just to make the light a little bit stronger on the upper edge of the scene. So I added the light rays using the sphere, a blurred version of the sphere as a mask. then I used another blurred version of the sphere as an additional light source on top of that. And finally, in terms of animated assets, we add the particle system. These very tiny little particles are again added to the scene, and by using the light rays output as the factor for the particles, this is the third time we're pulling this trick here, it creates this effect where the particles are brighter and more vibrant when they're in the light rays than they are when they exist outside. So they're dark, and even down here in the really dark area, they almost completely disappear. They don't exist. But as the light rays move around the scene, it makes these particles pop out as if they're actually in there and actually being affected by the light. And I got this idea, several of these ideas, actually from Andrew Kramer and his website, Video Copilot. He does a very similar kind of scene, although he accomplishes some other tasks in the scene. But he does a very similar thing using the light ray source as a mask to illuminate particles in the scene. From there, I do a little bit of color correction to get the color that I want, and then I add this vignette effect. And again, this is just an image that is overlaid. I add a heavy blur to it. It is applied via an alpha over node, and the factor is set very low to the desired amount. And then finally, on top of that, I add my bars, my anamorphic widescreen bars. Now, one last thing I want to mention. There is a section in here where I added a directional blur. Way back here, I take the output of the submarine, I add a RGB curve that makes the sub completely black, and then I added a directional blur. And this is what I was talking about. In terms of a directional blur node in Blender, it limits you to setting the center of the blur to only the space within the shot. So because of that, I'm at an advantage to keep it at a 16:9 aspect ratio to give myself a little bit of extra space and allow this blur to straighten out rather than be fanned out from underneath the submarine. And I apply this blur, and then again I applied a second blur, a Gaussian blur, only on the y-axis for 50 units, so that I could elongate that a little bit more, that black kind of shadowy figure. And then I applied this via an alpha over node on top of the submarine as it's composited into the scene. And actually I think on top of the, I applied it, no, it doesn't. It looks like I applied it underneath the light rays, but you could put it on top of the light rays, and it would make it appear as though those light rays are stopping when they hit the submarine and then casting a shadow. But it achieves the same kind of effect. And as the submarine moves through the water, we see this shadowy figure, this shadowy space underneath the sub follow it, which just adds another element of realism. That's pretty much the shot. The last thing I did is I applied this flip node, which I used earlier on the light rays, and we just flipped it on the x-axis to change the output just a little bit, so it looks essentially nothing like that original model that we were looking at. And I was fairly pleased with this. The render time is pretty quick. This is a 4 processor computer. Only a couple gigs of RAM. It's not the fastest machine in the world. Most typical laptops that you can buy now at a place like Walmart run much, much quicker. The render time per frame was about 20 seconds, and that's much, much less than it would be if we actually tried to use some ray tracing and lights reflecting on an actual model, and actually just the time in modeling something would take forever. So this is just an example of how one can use Blender as a compositing tool, a 3D compositing tool with 2-dimensional assets. So hopefully you can apply this to some of your projects, and hopefully this was helpful to you. Again, I'm Carl Irwin.